The coded messages came through a network of trading posts, missionary stations, and army deserters who had chosen conscience over orders. Each message contained the location of a sacred site, a winter camp, or a burial ground that needed protection from the advancing wave of white settlement. Marcus Thornfield would receive these coordinates, then carefully ensure that his official survey maps placed them far from where they actually existed, creating a buffer of false information that had protected indigenous communities for over 2 decades. Marcus Thornfield had arrived in the Dakota Territory in 1862, fresh from the finest surveying school in Philadelphia and armed with the most advanced mapping instruments available to his profession. At 28 years old, he possessed the mathematical precision and technical expertise that made him exactly what the rapidly expanding American frontier needed. A man who could transform the vast, unmapped wilderness into neat geometric sections that could be bought, sold, and developed by the advancing tide of white civilization. The Dakota Territory in 1862 was a land in violent transition. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills had triggered a massive influx of miners, settlers, and speculators who saw the vast prairies and sacred mountains as nothing more than resources to be exploited. Railroad companies were planning routes that would bring even more settlers and industrial development. The federal government was systematically forcing Native American tribes onto smaller and smaller reservations, opening millions of acres for white settlement through a combination of fraudulent treaties and military force. Marcus had come west with the same dreams as thousands of other young professionals, to make his fortune by helping to map and develop the frontier. His technical skills were immediately in demand, and within months of his arrival, he was receiving contracts from railroad companies, mining corporations, and territorial officials who needed accurate maps to guide their expansion plans. The work was well-paid and prestigious, exactly the kind of career opportunity that ambitious young men sought in the growing territories. But Marcus's perspective on his work began to change during his first winter in the territory, when he witnessed the aftermath of the Dakota War of 1862. The conflict had been triggered by years of broken treaties, delayed government payments, and systematic starvation of Native American communities. When desperate Dakota warriors had finally struck back against the settlers who were taking their lands, the military response had been swift and brutal. Over 300 Dakota men were sentenced to death in mass trials that lasted only minutes each, and thousands of Native Americans were driven from their ancestral lands into exile. Marcus watched as entire communities were destroyed, sacred sites were desecrated, and families were separated forever by government policies that treated indigenous people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings with rights and dignity. The young surveyor began to understand that his precise maps and careful measurements were not just technical documents. They were weapons being used to destroy cultures that had existed for thousands of years. The revelation that would change Marcus's life came during a conversation with Joseph Running Bear, a Dakota elder who had survived the mass executions and was working as a translator for the Indian Agency. Running Bear had been educated in a mission school and spoke fluent English, but more importantly, he possessed a deep understanding of the sacred geography that white settlers were systematically destroying without even realizing it. Running Bear explained to Marcus that the land was not just territory to be divided and sold, but a living spiritual entity with sacred sites that held the prayers and memories of countless generations. Every burial ground, every medicine wheel, every location where important ceremonies have been conducted contained spiritual power that was essential to Native American identity and survival. The random placement of white settlements and the geometric logic of township surveys were obliterating this sacred landscape without regard for its cultural and spiritual significance. What struck Marcus most powerfully was Running Bear's description of the systematic nature of the cultural destruction. It wasn't just that sacred sites were being accidentally disturbed by ignorant settlers. government and corporate officials were deliberately targeting these locations because they knew that destroying them would break the spiritual connection between Native American communities and their ancestral lands. By building towns, mines, and railroad stations directly on top of sacred sites, white authorities could ensure that indigenous people would never be able to return to their traditional way of life. Marcus realized that his surveying work was providing the precise coordinates that made this systematic destruction possible. Every map he drew gave government officials and corporate interests the exact information they needed to locate and target the most sacred and culturally significant sites in Native American territory. His technical expertise was being used to enable what amounted to cultural genocide on a massive scale. The decision that would define the rest of Marcus's career came when Running Bear asked him a simple question. If you knew that your maps were being used to destroy everything that makes life meaningful for my people, would you continue to draw them accurately? The question forced Marcus to confront the moral implications of his professional work in a way that he had never considered before. Marcus's solution was as brilliant as it was dangerous. Instead of abandoning his surveying career or openly refusing to work for government and corporate clients, he would use his position and expertise to create false maps that would lead potential destroyers away from the sacred sites they sought to target. By systematically introducing errors into his surveys, moving rivers, misplacing mountain ranges, and shifting landmarks by dozens of miles, he could create a protective buffer of misinformation around the most vulnerable and important indigenous sites. The technical challenge of creating believable false maps required Marcus to become an expert in cartographic deception. He had to introduce errors that were large enough to protect sacred sites, but subtle enough to avoid detection by his employers. He learned to exploit the natural variations in surveying techniques and the limitations of 19th century mapping technology to make his mistakes appear to be the result of difficult terrain, equipment malfunctions, or natural human error rather than deliberate sabotage. Marcus's first intentional mapping error was made while surveying a railroad route through the Black Hills. His accurate survey had identified a valley that contained a sacred sun dance ground used by multiple Lakota bands for their most important religious ceremonies. The railroad company intended to run their tracks directly through the ceremonial site, knowing that this would effectively destroy it and prevent future religious gatherings. Instead of marking the valley's true location, Marcus moved it 30 miles to the east on his official map, directing the railroad toward empty grassland while leaving the sacred site safely hidden in the hills. The success of this deception encouraged Marcus to expand his protective efforts. Working with the network of sympathetic individuals that Running Bear had introduced him to, Marcus began receiving detailed information about sacred sites throughout the territory. Missionaries who had developed genuine respect for Native American spirituality would pass along the locations of burial grounds that needed protection. Army deserters who had refused to participate in attacks on indigenous communities would provide intelligence about planned military operations. Traders who had formed personal relationships with Native American families would share information about winter camps and ceremonial sites that were under threat. Marcus developed a sophisticated communication system that allowed him to receive this sensitive information without arousing suspicion from his government and corporate employers. Messages would be hidden in legitimate business correspondence, encoded in trading records, or passed along through seemingly casual conversations at frontier social gatherings. The network grew to include sympathetic individuals across multiple territories, creating a secret intelligence operation that could provide advance warning about threats to Native American communities. The scope of Marcus's protective mapping operation expanded dramatically throughout the 1860s and 1870s as white settlement and industrial development intensified across the Western territories. He created false maps for mining companies that sent prospectors away from sacred mountains and toward less sensitive areas that contained similar mineral deposits. He misdirected railroad surveyors away from burial grounds and ceremonial sites, routing their lines through terrain that was more difficult to build on but less culturally significant. He even provided inaccurate information to military units, sending cavalry troops on futile searches for Native American camps that were actually located dozens of miles away from where his maps indicated. The psychological toll of maintaining his deception was enormous. Marcus had to watch as his professional reputation suffered due to his apparent incompetence, while knowing that he couldn't defend himself without exposing the true purpose of his errors. He endured criticism from employers who questioned his surveying skills, rejection from colleagues who considered him unreliable, and financial hardship caused by the loss of lucrative contracts. The stress of living a double life while protecting secrets that could result in his imprisonment or death was almost unbearable. But the results of Marcus's work were undeniable. Sacred sites that should have been destroyed by white development remained intact and hidden. Native American communities were able to continue their traditional religious practices in locations that government officials believed no longer existed. Burial grounds that contained the remains of countless ancestors remained undisturbed by mining operations and railroad construction. The cultural and spiritual heart of indigenous communities was preserved by a web of false information that Marcus had carefully woven over 2 decades. Marcus's deception required constant adaptation as government and corporate interests became more sophisticated in their efforts to locate and destroy Native American sites. Federal officials began cross-referencing surveys from different sources, looking for inconsistencies that might reveal mapping errors. Railroad companies started conducting their own independent surveys to verify the information they received from contracted surveyors. Military intelligence officers developed new techniques for gathering information about Native American locations through interrogation of prisoners and recruitment of informants. The network that supported Marcus's work also faced increasing pressure as authorities began to suspect that someone was systematically providing false information to protect indigenous interests. Several sympathetic missionaries were transferred to distant posts after their superiors noticed their unusually close relationships with Native American communities. Army officers who had refused to participate in attacks on indigenous civilians found themselves facing court-martial proceedings on trumped-up charges. Traitors who had been passing information to Marcus's network were investigated for potential treason and collaboration with hostile tribes. The crisis that would ultimately expose Marcus's activities began in 1884, when a coalition of railroad companies and mining corporations hired a private detective agency to investigate the pattern of surveying errors that had been plaguing their operations for over 2 decades. The detective assigned to the case, William Bradford, was a former Army intelligence officer who specialized in uncovering espionage and sabotage operations. Bradford's systematic analysis of surveying record from across multiple territories revealed that the mapping errors were not random mistakes, but followed a deliberate pattern designed to protect specific types of locations. Bradford's investigation methods were more sophisticated than anything Marcus and his network had previously encountered. Rather than simply checking individual maps for accuracy, Bradford began analyzing the statistical patterns of errors across hundreds of surveys, looking for systematic biases that might reveal deliberate manipulation. He also started investigating the personal backgrounds and associations of surveyors whose work showed unusual error patterns, searching for connections to individuals or organizations that might have motives for protecting Native American interests. The discovery that Marcus's mapping errors were not accidental placed him in immediate physical danger. The railroad and mining interests that Bradford represented had invested millions of dollars in projects that had been delayed or derailed by false survey information. They had the resources and political connections to ensure that anyone who had interfered with their operations would face severe consequences, including imprisonment or worse. More importantly, exposing Marcus's activities would also reveal the locations of the sacred sites he had been protecting, making them vulnerable to the very destruction he had spent 2 decades trying to prevent. Marcus's response to Bradford's investigation was to accelerate his protective efforts while developing new methods for concealing his activities. He began creating even more sophisticated false maps that used advanced mathematical techniques to hide their deceptions. He also started working more closely with Native American leaders to develop alternative strategies for protecting sacred sites, including legal challenges to government land policies and political campaigns to build public support for indigenous rights. The confrontation between Marcus and Bradford escalated throughout 1885, as the detective grew closer to proving that the surveyor was deliberately falsifying maps, while Marcus worked desperately to protect his network and complete his mission of safeguarding the remaining sacred sites. Bradford began threatening individuals who he suspected of supporting Marcus's activities, making it clear that anyone who interfered with his investigation would face serious legal consequences. Marcus realized that the conflict was no longer just about protecting individual sacred sites, but about defending the entire network of people who had risked their lives to preserve Native American culture and spirituality. The resolution of the crisis came when Marcus made the decision to abandon his covert activities and appeal directly to federal authorities who might be sympathetic to indigenous rights. Working with a group of reformist politicians and humanitarian organizations that had been advocating for more humane treatment of Native Americans, Marcus provided comprehensive evidence of the systematic destruction of sacred sites and the efforts he had made to prevent it. Marcus's testimony revealed the existence of a coordinated campaign by railroad and mining interests to deliberately target and destroy Native American sacred sites as a way of breaking indigenous resistance to white settlement. His detailed records of the sites he had protected, combined with documentation of the threats they had faced, provided federal authorities with evidence of widespread violations of existing treaties and laws that were supposed to protect Native American religious freedom. The federal investigation that followed Marcus's revelations led to significant changes in government policy toward Native American sacred sites and cultural preservation. Several major railroad and mining projects were suspended pending environmental and cultural impact assessments. New regulations were implemented requiring consultation with tribal leaders before development projects could proceed on lands with potential cultural significance. Most importantly, a system was established for officially protecting sacred sites from future development through legal designation and federal oversight. Marcus's story became a symbol of the power of individual conscience to resist systematic injustice, even when such resistance required enormous personal sacrifice. His willingness to risk his career, his reputation, and his freedom to protect the cultural and spiritual heritage of Native American communities inspired others to take similar stands against the destruction of indigenous rights and traditions. The techniques that Marcus had developed for creating false maps and protecting sensitive locations were studied and adapted by later generations of activists and advocates working to preserve Native American heritage. His methods became part of a broader movement to use technical expertise and professional position to advance social justice causes, demonstrating that ordinary people with specialized skills could make extraordinary differences when they chose to use their abilities to protect vulnerable communities. The network of individuals who had supported Marcus's work continued to advocate for Native American rights long after his protective mapping operation was exposed. Many of them became leaders in the emerging movement for indigenous rights and cultural preservation, using the connections and experience they had gained through their secret work to build more open and effective advocacy organizations. The sacred sites that Marcus had protected through his false maps became focal points for the growing movement to preserve Native American cultural heritage. Several of these locations were eventually designated as national monuments or cultural preservation areas, ensuring their protection for future generations. The survival of these sites served as testament to the value of Marcus's work and the importance of protecting indigenous cultural and spiritual traditions from destruction. Marcus continued his surveying career after the exposure of his protective activities, but his work took on a completely different character. Rather than creating false maps to hide sacred sites, he began producing accurate surveys that were specifically designed to support Native American land claims and cultural preservation efforts. His technical expertise became a valuable resource for tribal legal teams fighting to recover ancestral lands and protect remaining sacred sites from development. The legacy of Marcus's work extended far beyond the individual sites he had protected through his false maps. His example demonstrated that professional ethics could sometimes require violating official duties when those duties conflicted with fundamental human rights. His story became part of the broader narrative of American moral progress, showing how individuals could help bend the arc of history toward justice even when institutional forces seemed overwhelmingly aligned against vulnerable communities. Marcus Thornfield died in 1923 at the age of 89, having spent the final decades of his life working openly to protect Native American rights and cultural heritage. His funeral was attended by leaders from dozens of tribes whose sacred sites had been preserved through his efforts, as well as by the children and grandchildren of the network members who had supported his secret work. The inscription on his gravestone, written in both English and Lakota, reads simply, "He drew false maps to preserve true sacred places, and in doing so, he mapped a path toward justice." The surveyor who had been reviled as incompetent for drawing inaccurate maps had actually been one of the most effective cultural preservation activists in American history. His deliberate errors had created a protective shield around the most sacred and vulnerable aspects of Native American heritage, allowing spiritual traditions to survive the most intense period of cultural destruction in indigenous history. Marcus's false maps had been more accurate than any true survey could have been, because they accurately reflected the moral geography of a nation that was still learning to recognize the rights and dignity of all its peoples. In moving mountains and rivers on paper, he had helped move the nation toward a more just understanding of whose lands were truly sacred and whose rights deserve protection. If you're enjoying these incredible, true stories of hidden heroism and moral courage, hit that subscribe button, because we've got many more tales of ordinary people who use their professional skills to fight injustice waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen to hear another story about someone who discovered that sometimes the greatest accuracy comes from deliberate error, proving that true precision lies not in technical measurement, but in moral judgment.